Raymond Harlow had been called many things in his life: hero, oracle, savior, and occasionally, a necessary evil. But no title quite suited him like the arbiter of truth. When a crisis arose, when politicians lied through their teeth or the corporate world put up false facades, the world turned to him. And he always delivered the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. He could see through any lie, no matter how deeply buried. He didn't need to interrogate or probe. All he had to do was listen for a second longer than anyone else, and the truth would surface like a bubble in a glass of still water. He had never wanted this ability, never asked for it. But somewhere along the way, it became his gift to the world, and the world, for all its flaws, was desperate for it. But no one warned him that there could be such a thing as too much truth. The first time Raymond felt the weight of his ability was at the international summit held in a luxurious city that had sprung up from the desert like an oasis of steel and glass. The summit was an annual affair, where leaders from all over the globe gathered to discuss matters of peace, resources, and, as was often the case, the latest diplomatic scandals. Raymond sat in the back of the hall, waiting for the call to come forward. He was always the guest of honor. In a room full of diplomats, military generals, and business tycoons, he was the one who carried the most power, not because of political connections, not because of wealth, but because of his ability to tell the truth. The world needed truth, after all. And Raymond was the only one who could offer it. The summit was supposed to be a celebration of diplomacy, of international cooperation. But there was a hidden agenda. The real reason Raymond was called was not to reveal the latest intelligence on global threats, but to solve a crisis that no one wanted to acknowledge. There were whispers in the halls about corruption in the government, about backroom deals that had set countries on the edge of war. Raymond's job was simple: lay it all bare. He stood up when his name was called. As he walked to the podium, the leaders of the world turned their eyes toward him with a mixture of awe and fear. They were looking for salvation. They wanted truth, but what they really wanted was for Raymond to make their lives easier. They wanted the truth to match their desires, their needs. But Raymond knew better. "Ladies and gentlemen," Raymond began, his voice calm, authoritative. "I've been asked to reveal the truth behind the current conflict. And the truth is this." He paused, and for the first time in his career, he hesitated. The words didn't feel right. They tasted sour in his mouth. The truth he was about to speak wasn't the truth they wanted. It was the truth that would tear down empires. He cleared his throat. "The truth is, that every single one of you has lied. You've all built this conflict on a foundation of deception. The war you fear is not a product of international pressure, but of your own greed, manipulation, and corruption." The room went silent. Raymond could feel the weight of their eyes, the fear, the anger. For a moment, he almost regretted speaking. He could have stopped there, spun some tale, given them what they wanted. They would have applauded him, thanked him, and the world would have continued as it always did. But Raymond Harlow was no liar. He was the arbiter of truth, but truth, it seemed, was the last thing they wanted. The reaction to Raymond's revelation was immediate and violent. Within seconds, the summit hall erupted into chaos. Some of the leaders stood, shouting accusations at one another. Others sat, stunned into silence. It wasn't just that they had been exposed, it was the fact that Raymond had dared to speak the truth at all. A diplomat from Eastern Europe, his face flushed red with anger, stood up. "You can't say that. You're a liar." He slammed his fist on the table. "You've just ruined everything." Raymond stood there, unmoving, as the shouting grew louder. He could feel the tension building in the air. The weight of truth pressed on his shoulders. There had been a time when he would have felt proud in moments like this, knowing that his words would set things right, that justice would be served. But now, all he felt was dread. The truth, it seemed, had a price. And in this moment, that price was the collapse of the world order. He had been wrong. The world was not built on truth. It was built on lies. Lies were what held everything together. Without them, everything would crumble. And he had just been the one to push it all over the edge. As the summit came to an end in utter disarray, Raymond was escorted out of the building by his security detail. The leaders who had once praised him as the savior of truth now regarded him with disdain. The media, which had followed him everywhere, now turned on him with a venomous fury. He was the villain. He was the one who had ruined everything. The outside world had never felt so cold. Raymond sat in the back of a black sedan, staring out the window at the city lights flickering past. He had always known that truth was a dangerous weapon. But he hadn't realized until that moment just how fragile the world was. People depended on lies to survive. They weren't interested in the truth. They wanted comfort, stability, and peace, even if that peace was built on a foundation of corruption. He thought back to the cases he had worked on in the past: corporate scandals, political betrayals, personal secrets. Each time, he had believed that revealing the truth would make everything better. But now, he wasn't so sure. The world, it seemed, wasn't ready for the truth. People needed lies. They needed them like air, like food, and yet, Raymond Harlow had spent his life revealing nothing but truth. The following days were filled with meetings, calls, and inquiries. The international community wanted to understand how things had gone so wrong. Leaders, in their desperation, began to reach out to Raymond for help. But their tone was different now. They no longer wanted his truth, they wanted his silence. They wanted him to undo what he had done. "You have to fix this," a voice on the other end of the phone said one evening. It was Iris, his wife, a former journalist. She had always supported his mission, but now there was a note of desperation in her voice. "Raymond, you've broken everything. You've exposed things that didn't need to be exposed. The world doesn't know how to function with so much truth. You have to fix it." But Raymond was silent. He had always believed that the truth was the ultimate equalizer. But now, he saw it for what it truly was, a weapon of mass destruction. For the first time in his life, Raymond Harlow wondered if his gift was really a gift at all. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, reports, and public apologies. The summit's organizers tried to make it seem as if nothing had happened. They promised that the truth would be re-examined in a more controlled manner, and that Raymond's statements would be taken out of context. Raymond knew better than to believe it. The lies were already taking shape. People had started rewriting history, trying to explain away the uncomfortable truths he had uncovered. The leaders who had once sworn by his ability now tried to bury it. At night, Raymond would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. He had always believed that truth was a virtue, something to be revered. But now, he wasn't so sure. What good was the truth if it destroyed everything in its path? There had to be a balance. There had to be a way to let people live without tearing down the world they had built. Raymond sat at the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, as the world outside continued on its frantic course. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls, messages, and notifications from people wanting answers, wanting solutions. But what could he offer them now? The truth? No, they didn't want the truth. They wanted something far more dangerous, a lie to cling to. A comfortable lie to keep the world from collapsing into chaos. He thought of Iris. She had been a journalist once, brave, passionate, a woman who believed in truth above all else. She had admired Raymond's work when they met, thought him to be the shining beacon of moral clarity in an increasingly murky world. But now, she was questioning everything. Her voice on the phone had been tense, sharp. He could hear the anger in her words, but also something else, fear. Raymond had spent years building a reputation on his ability to expose the truth. He had built his career on it. And now? Now that reputation was crumbling faster than he could process. He had always been able to sense when things were wrong, when lies were being spun and the truth was being buried, but now the lines were blurry. He couldn't tell anymore if he was the savior of the world or the one who had condemned it to burn. The days blurred together. News outlets across the globe cycled through his name like a flashing banner, as if his very existence had become an indictment of the entire global system. The world had gone into full panic mode. Every country that had participated in the summit demanded clarification. Every government was scrambling to repair the damage. Leaders who had once hailed him as a hero now turned their backs on him, making him the scapegoat for their own mistakes. Raymond had always been certain that truth was the only way forward. The only way to heal. But now, in the aftermath of his revelations, it felt like the world was bleeding out under the weight of that truth. The people, the politicians, the world itself, they couldn't handle it. And perhaps that was his fault. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. He didn't have to ask who it was. He knew. "Iris," he called out, his voice weary. The door opened slowly, and Iris stepped into the room, her face tired and drawn. Her usually sharp eyes were clouded with frustration, but there was also a deeper sadness there. She walked over to him and stood silently for a moment, just looking at him, as if trying to figure out who he was now. "You need to fix this," she said, her voice steady, but there was a crack in it. Raymond shook his head. "I can't. I've already said too much." She sat beside him on the bed, her hand brushing against his as if to steady herself. "No, you don't understand. The world can't function on this kind of honesty. People need their illusions. They need their lies, Raymond. They're not strong enough to face the truth." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm starting to realize that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't just the world they were facing now, it was themselves. Iris had always stood beside him, encouraging him to be the man who could reveal the truth and change the world. Now, it seemed that they were standing on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to cross. "I just don't know what to do anymore," Raymond finally admitted, his voice raw. "I've spent my whole life tearing down lies, but now I see how fragile everything really is. I've built my entire identity on the truth. But what if the truth is just too destructive? What if the lies are the things that hold us all together?" Iris sighed deeply. "You're not wrong to question it. But you can't just stop. You're the only one who has the power to see through the mess, to make things right. You can't throw that away." "But what if that's what we need to survive?" Raymond replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if the world, the way it is, has to rely on those lies to keep going? What if I've been wrong all this time?" Iris didn't answer right away. She stood and paced the room, then stopped and turned to face him. "Maybe we need to accept that we can't always fix things, Raymond. Maybe the world doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be allowed to continue. People are going to lie. They always have, they always will. You can't change that." Raymond looked up at her. His heart felt heavy with the weight of her words. He had spent years exposing lies, revealing the ugly truths hidden beneath the surface. But now, the idea of letting things be, of letting people live in their comfortable illusions, felt like betrayal. He had always believed in the power of truth. But was it possible that truth, in the end, wasn't the answer? "I don't know who I am without this," Raymond said, his voice faltering. "I've always been the truth-teller. The one who could see things others couldn't. What if that's not enough anymore?" "You don't have to be anyone else," Iris said softly. "You're still the same person. You just need to understand that you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. No one can fix everything. Not even you." Raymond nodded slowly, taking in her words. He could feel the exhaustion in his bones, the weariness that had settled into every corner of his life. Maybe Iris was right. Maybe there was nothing more he could do. The next few weeks passed in a haze. The summit's aftermath reverberated through every aspect of Raymond's life. He watched the world try to heal, to rebuild the lies that had once held it together. The leaders who had once depended on him now turned away, speaking in guarded tones, avoiding the uncomfortable questions he had raised. They painted over the cracks in the facade with more lies, pretending as if nothing had changed, and yet, the world was changing. People were beginning to question things. The cracks were visible, even to those who wanted to ignore them. The truth had seeped in small ways, and nothing could ever be the same again, but in the privacy of his own thoughts, Raymond began to wonder, what was the cost of truth? Had it been worth it? Had he made a difference, or had he just been a catalyst for destruction? Iris had left him, unable to reconcile the man he had become with the man she had once believed in. He couldn't blame her. She had always been pragmatic, more willing to accept the world as it was. But Raymond had never been able to let things lie. He had always believed that truth could set people free, but now he was uncertain that in his quiet moments, Raymond reflected on the moments when his truth had been so pure, so simple. He thought of his earliest cases, of the smaller lies he'd uncovered, an affair, a fraudulent investment, a cheating spouse. Those had been easy. Simple, even. But this? This was different. The lie that held the world together wasn't something he could simply undo with one quick statement. It was deep, systemic. It was woven into the fabric of society itself. One evening, Raymond stood by his apartment window, looking out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, a sprawling network of lives, each with its own stories, its own lies. He wondered how many people out there had never even considered the truth. How many of them had never even asked the questions that haunted him. Could they live in their ignorance? Could they be happy? Was it possible to go back? But in the end, Raymond knew the answer. The truth wasn't something that could be repressed forever. It was there, waiting to be uncovered. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't his place to expose it. He turned away from the window, a decision settling in his chest like a stone. He couldn't fix the world. He couldn't even fix himself. But maybe, for once, he could just let things be. Maybe it was time to stop being the arbiter of truth, and let the world find its own way. Raymond's decision to step away from the public felt like a breath of fresh air, at least for a few moments. The silence that filled his apartment was almost too loud, a stark contrast to the constant din of demands and expectations that had consumed his life for so long. For once, there was no one waiting for him to reveal another truth, no one asking for his insight into the world's lies. It felt like freedom, but freedom at a steep price. Iris's absence was a constant ache in his chest. She had been the last person who truly believed in him, who stood by him even when the world seemed to turn against him. Without her, the apartment felt like an empty shell, a place where echoes lingered longer than memories. His mind often wandered to the last conversation they had, to the moments when he had allowed doubt to seep in. Was it so wrong, what he had done? He had told the truth, but had he also destroyed everything that made people feel safe? Iris had been right about one thing: people needed their lies. Without them, the world would fall apart, and truth wasn't the balm that could heal those fractures. Yet, even in the quiet, Raymond couldn't escape the voice that had been his guide for so long, the voice of absolute clarity, the sense that what he knew was what others needed to hear. But what did it mean now? What was the purpose of the truth if it simply destroyed everything in its path? He couldn't stay silent forever. The world had become a maze of contradictions, and someone had to find the way through. But who would be brave enough to navigate it now? The days bled into each other, and Raymond found himself pacing the apartment, picking at old case files and looking at newspaper clippings that had once meant something. They were all stories of lies, lies he had uncovered, truths he had revealed. The weight of it felt suffocating, but there was no turning away from it. The world had changed, but not in the way he'd imagined. People hadn't embraced truth the way he'd hoped. They had resisted it, fought against it with everything they had. He thought about the powerful figures he had once helped. The corporate moguls, the politicians, the military leaders, people who had once trusted him. They had all been so eager to have the truth delivered to them. But when it came, when the veil was lifted, they had recoiled. They had clung to the lies like a lifeline, desperate not to let go. Raymond couldn't blame them. He had witnessed the unraveling of their world, their carefully constructed facades, and they had done whatever they could to piece things back together, but they hadn't fixed it. They had only made it worse. There was no turning back. The truth had become a fire that no one knew how to control. It had scorched everything in its path, and yet, despite all of this, Raymond couldn't ignore the call to action. It gnawed at him in the quiet moments, tugging at the edges of his thoughts like a faint, insistent whisper. He had stopped being the arbiter of truth, but had he really stopped wanting to make things right? What if the world didn't need another truth-teller? What if it needed someone to take the pieces of what remained, the remnants of trust, of humanity, and find a way to rebuild it? The truth had shattered everything. Maybe it was time for something else, an acceptance of the lies, a willingness to let them be, but not at the cost of everything else. He thought of his work, of the times when he had uncovered a small lie here, a little deception there, and how, in the grand scheme of things, the world had gone on. Maybe the lies weren't the enemy. Maybe the real enemy was the expectation that truth could fix everything. What if he could find a way to live in this world, one that relied on lies, without destroying it? He didn't have the answers, but he couldn't keep running from the question either. One morning, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, one he didn't recognize. He hesitated, the weight of his past decisions pressing on him, but after a moment, he answered. Raymond Harlow, the voice on the other end said, cold and authoritative. I know who you are, Raymond replied, already sensing that this call would not be a simple one. I've been instructed to contact you. We need you back in the field. There's a situation. Raymond's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to be back in the field. He didn't want to be the man everyone called when things fell apart. He didn't want to be the person who had to choose between truth and destruction anymore. I'm retired, Raymond said, his voice firm. I'm not doing this anymore. The voice on the other end didn't relent. You don't have a choice. The situation is critical. There are truths that need to be uncovered. If you won't do it, we'll find someone else. But we'd rather have you. Raymond's grip tightened around the phone. The world had called him once again, and despite everything, he knew he couldn't walk away from it. It wasn't just about the truth. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't put into words, but that he had felt every time he had walked away from a case, every time he had taken a step back and let things unfold without him. The world needed guidance, even if that guidance meant the destruction of everything in its path. I'll be there, Raymond said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. That he hung up the phone and sat in the silence that followed. There was no going back. He had made his decision, and now, like always, he would face the consequences of it. The case was unlike any he had dealt with before. It wasn't political or corporate, and it wasn't about exposing a single lie. This time, it was something bigger, more dangerous. A series of explosive events had been set in motion, each one connected to a vast web of deceit that spanned across multiple nations. The people who had reached out to him weren't asking for a solution. They were asking for answers. Answers that only Raymond could provide. But this time, he wasn't sure he wanted to be the one to give them. The deeper he dug into the case, the more he realized how complicated everything had become. The lies were no longer simple. They weren't just words or actions. They were systems, entrenched, powerful, and impossible to untangle without bringing everything crashing down. Raymond found himself in a place he hadn't expected. He wasn't just uncovering the truth, he was being asked to dismantle an entire world built on it. If he revealed what he knew, it would destroy everything. And yet, if he stayed silent, the world would keep spinning, and the lies would continue to be the glue holding it all together. He thought back to his conversation with Iris, to the words she had said. Maybe it's not your job to fix everything. For the first time in a long while, Raymond wasn't sure what the right choice was. But one thing was clear, the truth had a cost. And it was a cost that no one, least of all him, could afford. Raymond returned to his apartment that evening, his mind spinning with the enormity of the decisions that lay ahead. He had always known that the truth was a powerful tool, but now he wondered if it was a weapon that could destroy everything he had fought for. He had walked away from the role of truth-teller, only to find that the world wasn't ready to let him go, but as the weight of his choices pressed down on him, Raymond knew there was no turning back. The truth would be exposed, no matter what. The only question was how much of the world would survive when it did. The cost of truth, it seemed, was always greater than anyone could imagine.